Okay, good evening. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. You don't know how many people are out there in cyberspace, right? I know quite a few. Simon Jacobson here, and I am here to speak about mob mentality. The topic you did read, right? So the topic is mob mentality. How we influenced, how impacted are we by mob mentality? By the herd mentality. And it's based on the theme, central theme of this week's Torah chapter, which is the story, the episode, the tragic episode of the scouts sent by Moses to scout out the promised land. So he chose, as the beginning of this parsha begins, this chapter, chose the 12 best men, the leaders of the tribes. So a leader of each tribe, and the Torah delineates, spells out their names, and says clearly what kind of great leaders they were, and charged them with a mission to go to Israel, which was the land that the Jewish people were traveling toward through the wilderness, and check out what's the best way to conquer this land. Before you go into a land, to see there were people living there, they knew there were enemies there, they knew that people had occupied the territory since the Jews had left Israel many years earlier, when Jacob and 70 souls went down to Egypt and ended up turning into the long exile. So hundreds of years have passed since then. So now as they were returning, they went to check out how the best way to enter this land. And they came back with a report, but this report ended up becoming tragic, because they essentially claimed this land is unconquerable. It's a land full of giants, full of powerful people. It's a land, as they put it in those memorable words, a land that consumes its inhabitants. Eretz Echelish Yeshveh, the Torah tells us. A land that consumes its inhabitants, which of course has many meanings, and I've discussed them over the years. Meanings that include, of course, the physical meaning, but also the psychological one, that it's a land of materialism. And materialism throughout history we see as a force that consumes its inhabitants. Everybody is affected, impacted by the tug and the power of material world. Money, control, power, the competition, and so on. So the scouts came back with this report saying, we cannot enter, we cannot conquer, it's impossible. Basically, they defied God's promise. Essentially, if it was up to them, they would have remained in the wilderness and never entered this holy land. Except two people, two of the 12, Caleb and Joshua, Caleb and Joshua, they stood up and said, no, God promised us this land, it's a good land, it's a beautiful land, a very good land, they said, and that we could conquer it, and we go with the promises, and with faith and trust, we'll be able to overcome any challenge. But they were silenced. They were almost killed by the mob that became enraged and were instigated by these 10 leaders. So this becomes the first great tragedy in Jewish history. On Tisha B'Av, the Torah tells us this all happened on the saddest day of the year. Actually, this was the saddest day. This is why it became the saddest day of the year. That Tisha B'Av, and God said, you cried for slandering the land that I promised you. Now this will be a day that you will cry for generations to come. And as a result of their great mutiny, every one of the people that left Egypt, with all the miracles, every one of them, down to except Caleb and Yeshua, everyone died in the wilderness. God basically gave them their self-fulfilling prophecy. Since they said they don't want to go into the promised land, God said, okay, so you won't. And they all died in the desert the next 40 years. And it was their children that would enter the promised land, led by Joshua. Even Moses ends up also remaining in the desert, in the wilderness. And all because of this mob incitement. So I thought appropriate, especially in context of, I always try to focus on the relevant message and lesson to our lives today, there are obvious lessons of how we make decisions. So I thought appropriate to talk about this idea of the herd mentality, where asking the blunt questions that are always difficult to really address, which is, where do you stand if the mob is going one direction and you, even if your conscience tells you it's wrong, what would you do? So of course, most of us, you ask this question, if you saw 500 people marching in one direction and you don't even know where they're going, would you march along or would you ignore them and go your own way? If you saw 500 people lynching, a lynch mob, going to lynch someone, would you participate? Or would you stand alone? Would you walk away? So most of us would answer these questions, especially since we like to think we're independent and free people, that maybe the first group I maybe march along because I don't know where it's going and I find out. But the second group, lynch mob, for sure I wouldn't join. Most of us would usually have that type of reaction, especially if you're a really fierce free spirit, fiercely independent. You would say, even the first group, I don't just go along with people just because they're going that direction. Well, then one has to wonder, what about all those stories we hear about very good people and ethical people suddenly caught in a situation like stuck on a mountain in an avalanche, in a blizzard, don't have any food, and you see very good people suddenly turning on the weakest in their group, even resorting to, I don't even want to say it, cannibalism. It's not one incident. You find it more than one. And the situations where people in very dire circumstances, where you feel threatened, suddenly turn into beasts. And yes, we'll turn into a mob. You all read Lord of the Flies with the children, group of children. Children are considered to be innocent, pure. There's a certain power of a mob that affects people. So yes, maybe in regular circumstances you're not just joining a lynch mob, but if it's a little irregular, what would you do? We'll take surveys at the end. And then you have, of course, maybe the classical example, if I can call it that, of the 20th century, the Germans. 100 million Germans who consider themselves highly cultured, advanced society with science and medicine and art and music and philosophy. They consider themselves the fathers of emancipation, the fathers of the Enlightenment. And yet, they were able to turn into monsters. Of course, the debate rages on whether all 100 million Germans were monsters. So recently, remember that book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, Goldhagen's theory. Whether you adopt the theory that people are, Germans are unique in some way, but one thing is for sure, however you look at it, there was a mob mentality, and many people were, the crime was not necessarily directly killing someone, but being silent in the face of it. And there are theories about people authority, that when police round you up and they tell you things, people just respond to authority irrationally. So if cops would round up 100 people, some statistics say those 100 people, they say, shoot, here these 10 criminals or prisoners, people have this blind adherence to authority. I'm not going into the psychological elements of it, or actually the psychological elements is what I do want to go to. I'm not going into whether people are guilty or not. There's no question we don't accept Eichmann's defense of, I just listened to authority, and therefore basically everybody was just listening to authority, so the only one responsible was the guy, Hitler himself, which of course is ridiculous because you can't do it yourself. But it's a study that perhaps till the end of days will continue to haunt us, of how perfectly fine human beings turned on their own neighbors simply because they were Jewish, or they were gypsies, or they were homosexuals, or whatever it was that they decided to stigmatize. So to just say that, hey, I wouldn't become part of the herd mentality is very nice. None of us would like to become, but history shows, and history is witness to people very much stooping to a very low common denominator. That's on a very extreme sense. And let's talk on a more subtle sense. We live in a society where there's constant pressure on us. How would you be if you saw in your own office, your workplace, where the whole office turns on one person? Would you have the courage and the guts to stand up and defend that person if you knew it was, baseless? Or you'd just be quiet? Because your job may be on the line. You want to be accepted by everybody. How many people do you know would just get up there? Yes, it's like we all would like to get the medal for it, but I'm talking about when it's uncomfortable. And how many people have compromised their ideals by becoming capable of backstabbing even best friends when you climb the ladder of success. Again, nobody wants to talk about these things, and nobody says it's always everyone else. Nobody ever will acknowledge that I really was there, which just shows you how much denial there is around this. So these are tough questions, and they're usually not asked, definitely not of ourselves. And then, of course, just to add to the equation, to make the case, you see the effects, the subliminal or direct overt effects of advertising, marketing. We live in a world of all these, the impact of mass culture, of mass of media, that affects all people. What you watch, how you dress, even mannerisms, behavior, and so on. So you have to wonder, where is that, if there is, and if there is, and where is that free spirit? If you really find somebody that stands up like that and is able to just say something that's completely different than everyone else. And when someone does, we consider them, we herald them, and hail them as leaders. So clearly this does touch a nerve, this whole story here with the scouts, where a group of 10 people who were leaders and perceived as such and were respected as such. Rashi even says that when Moses sent them, in that moment they were actually kosher, which means they were holy, and they were kosher, meaning here not kosher for Passover or kosher for kosher meat, meaning that they were kosher in the sense that they were pure and their intentions were pure. They were not criminal. They were not malicious. By the way, if you want, you can see me. There's a lot of seats, or if you insist on not seeing, it's all right. I'm just telling you there are options in life. Yeah. So the question here, you see right here, a case study of 10 leaders. They come back. The Jewish people were expecting to hear a good report, or they were at least expecting to hear what these scouts would come back with, a way of entering the promised land. And when they together, 10 of them, it wasn't one of them, all came together and all slandered the Holy Land, the promised land, and to the extent where they incited the people to not want to enter, you see what kind of effect they had. So even though Kalev and Yeshua were these lone two rangers who were different, and we'll talk about that, what made them different, why didn't they go along, what was the secret? But here you have maybe the first documented case study of mob mentality, herd mentality, where all the promises that they had heard, what they'd witnessed, remember they had witnessed the miracles of leaving Egypt. You could have been a skeptic 210 years, generations in exile. It's one thing. But once they were redeemed from there, and they saw the parting of the sea, and they saw different miracles that took place, Sinai, and still 10 people could come and incite them all, there you see how distorted all of us can become when there's a certain type of mob or herd type of mass mentality. And these were, as I said, these were evolved people. They're called the Dardeya, a generation of knowledgeable people. They were not small people. They were great sages among them, leaders, and so on. So 2 individuals among millions were the only ones that stood up and challenged. And they, as I said, were rewarded. They were the only 2 that ended up entering the promised land. So I think this is a great springboard, an opportunity to define and to figure out what it is about us all, and how can we find that type of strength and fortitude to really be yourself. Now, this is a little tough subject, as I said before, more than a little tough, because most people simply will not acknowledge that they're not free and independent spirits. Most people think that they are not part of a herd or a mob. That's how it is. So then you get back to the problem of have the cure of a disease is knowing it. If you're in denial and you're not even capable of acknowledging that you may be one of those type of people, you're definitely never going to free yourself from it. So the Torah, in its classic way, does not mince words and talks about even these great men. You could think, why would the Torah tell us thousands of years later? Why do we need to know how they slandered the land. Why do we need to slander them in a way? Lashon hara about them, even though they did something wrong. Because it's coming to tell you that nobody is immune to mob mentality. There's no such thing. Everybody is affected by it. Even the 10 great leaders, these giants who were the leaders, the Nisim, the leaders of their tribes, which means they were literally the leader, the greatest, most spiritual, advanced individual among thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. They too fell into this trap. And of course it became, once not only one person slandered it, not only one person, it was 10 of them, it becomes a group. And once there's a group, there's a certain type of reinforcement, the vicious cycle of self-reinforcement that any mob contains. Like you start saying, well, if so many people are saying it, how could it be wrong? You know? Which so much affects many axioms and many truths, so-called truths that we embrace, where we simply accept it because everyone's saying it. The New York Times says it. How could it not be true? If so many people have accepted it, it must be true. Now, I'm not denying the fact that, yes, when a lot of people have reviewed something, it usually gives you a test of so-called different, but who says all these people reviewed it? Maybe everyone's saying the same thing. Everyone's looking around and looking at everyone else. The blind leading the blind, and new standards are being created, and you start wondering who really initiated this. How did this become a reality? Look, millions and millions of people drink Coca-Cola. How many people would say this is some type of divine absolute truth that you have to drink Coke? And that's a simply innocuous, almost superfluous example. How many more deeper truths, so-called truths, that we just accept to be reality? So don't ever underestimate the power of marketing. So all you have to do is see how enraged and how passionate sports fans become over something that has absolutely no significance in the real world. So there's all kinds of examples of how ridiculous people can be when it becomes a certain mass way of thinking. And so the first lesson is, as we learn from these people, nobody is immune to this. So of course the big question is, so how did Caleb and Joshua really maintain their composure, maintain their independence to the threat of their own life? They were ready to kill them when they heard them starting to defend the promised land. In other words, here were two people who were not accepting what everyone else was saying. And as we all know, kill the witness. That's what criminals love to do. Instead of acknowledging a crime, there's one person who is a detractor. You consider him the criminal and say, kill him, kill the witness to the murder. Then it's as if it didn't happen. So this effect of the group is a very powerful one. And that story, the analogy they give of a great king who gave notice that he was coming to visit a very small port town. This was a big thing, a great leader coming to visit this port town. So they were thinking of ways of how could they honor the king. They didn't have much. And what could they give him as a gift that he would value? So they came up with an idea that they can't give him something necessarily that's very precious, because whatever they give him, he has more than they have. So they said, but the gesture he would appreciate. So they decided to set up a big barrel in the center of this town. And everyone in the town, as poor as they were, was expected to pour a goblet of wine into this barrel. And they would give the barrel of wine to the king as a gift. And he would appreciate and understand that, as poor as they were, it's difficult for them to give wine. But they tried their best, and together they gave him this big barrel of wine. It was like a gesture, a token gesture of... Now, of course, these Jews in this town were pretty smart, as usual. So everyone said to themselves... one guy said to his wife, he says, listen, since everyone's pouring wine anyway, why should we give up something so precious? How much wine do we have? We have saved for Passover or for Shabbos. So we'll pour a bottle of water into the barrel. It will be insignificant in the face of everyone else's wine. Now, of course, every family thought of the same brilliant innovation. So yes, the great king came and he got himself a barrel of water. This is the classic example, or the one about the Jewish rowing team that kept losing all the races. So they just said, you know what? They said, go figure out how the non-Jews do it. They keep winning these races, these rowing races. So they send a Jewish spy, a scout, to check out some of these Ivy League university rowing teams. And he comes back with a big secret. He says, listen, I got the secret. They have one guy yelling and everybody else is rowing. Which means by the Jews it was the other way around. Everybody was yelling and one guy was rowing. That's the secret. So there's that element when you see everyone, or you think everyone, it becomes like a certain type of mentality where you start losing the significance of your personal voice, because you say there's a big group out there. They tell the guy that's walking along the beach and he's throwing clams back into the water, to keep them alive. When they get grounded on the beach, they die. So someone said, you know how many clams there are? Millions and millions on the beach. What does it matter that you're going to throw a few clams back into the water? So the guy answered, he said, but for this clam it matters. In other words, when you think in terms of numbers, 6 billion people on this earth, you start thinking, how significant can I be? Because even if I do have a voice, so what? Which is, of course, the first excuse why we don't protest. Because you say it wouldn't make a difference. There's too many people already arguing otherwise. As we all know, it's really an excuse, because what difference does it make? The fact is, if it's true, if you see, as I said, somebody in your office or somebody in your community is being witch hunt, is being stigmatized, or is being targeted, the fact is your own morality, your own ethics should dictate a type of independence to be able to stand up. Of course, the next excuse is you don't want to jeopardize your own situation. And as I said earlier, when you really take it to an extreme, subtly you could say, okay, marketing, big thing, Coca-Cola, everybody drinks it. What's the big thing? But if you take it to the extreme can be life and death. As I said, look at the Germans in the 30s and 40s. And look at what happens in situations where people are very in crisis situations, I mentioned, where people have resorted to cannibalism even, turning on one weaker member or one weaker person in the party when you see everyone else doing it. So, and then I mentioned also the Lord of the Flies. Children in particular could also be very cruel, even though they're naturally kind. But when there's a mob, that's what happens. Sometimes I think back at some of the things we did as kids. It was very embarrassing. And you want to correct certain things, certain type of turning on some of our weaker teachers, so to speak. You become very cruel, even though you don't really, it's not malicious, but the fact is it becomes a group against one. They're very powerful, very compelling. You feel accepted, you feel like a whole hero, when in truth is you're just participating in a lynch mob, in a subtle sense or in a larger sense of the word. So thank God we don't live in a world where most of us necessarily are tested in this way, but it is definitely a good challenge to our character to wonder about these things, especially in this week's chapter. So the first lesson is that nobody is immune to this, even these 10 great men. Handpicked by Moses, and they were, at the time when they were sent, they were pure of heart. They didn't go with bad intentions. It wasn't like they were setting it up that they would come back with a bad report. That was never their intention. But once they got frightened, or whatever it was that weakened them, they did become a mob, and they became a first minion. One of the reasons that we I hope they're not coming here. One of the reasons we have a minyan, a quorum of 10 men, is a tikkun, is a type of repair for the minyan that came together here, the 10 men that came together in a plot, which is one of the reasons, by the way, why women are not part of a minyan, because no women were part of this conspiracy. Interesting to note. It was men that plotted this slander. And therefore we correct it, we repair it by a minyan coming together to pray, or other power that a minyan has, a minyan being 10 people coming together. So all this leads up to the big question, besides what type of person are you, what is it the secret of the Kolov and Yeshua's secret? And can we really learn to stand up proud, discover who you are, as opposed to what the community, your community, the peer pressure, the social pressure demands and expects of us, to be yourself. That's the big issue. Can you be yourself? Here ended up being only 2 people ended up being themselves. And that's why they were the only 2 that were entering the promised land. The Holy Land is a place for being yourself. God didn't need people who are herd mentality people in this holy land. As I said before, they wrote their own script. They chose to say that the land was not good enough, so they ended up not entering it. So on a very basic level, what distinguished Kalev and Yeshua was that, as the Torah tells us, that Kalev, Moses prayed for Joshua. That's why he's called Yehoshua, which is, as Rashi says, the name of God is there, that God should save him. Yehoshua means God should protect and save him. So Moses prayed for Joshua. Why Joshua? Because Joshua was his most devout disciple. He would be the person that would fill Moses' shoes. He was Moses' successor, and he would lead the Jewish people into the promised land. And Kalev, the Torah also says, also went to pray at the grave of the Ma'arat HaMachpelah in Hebron. On their way into Israel, he stopped to pray at the grave of our patriarchs. In Hebron, if you've anyone been there? To Hebron? The burial spot of Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah. Rachel is buried on the road called Kever Rachel, on the road to Bethlehem. That's where she was buried, as the Bible documents, and where you can see it till this day. Until this day, they're still fighting over that area. So Kalev, on his way into Israel, stopped there to pray. So that's one thing that distinguishes these two that the other 10 did not do. Now, as I said, the other 10 were not secular non-believers. They were actually great, great men. As a matter of fact, in Hasidic and Kabbalistic thought, it says one of their main intentions why they didn't want to go into the Promised Land was not they suddenly got scared of giants. They had seen great miracles, these leaders. It was because of their spirituality that they didn't want to enter. Because they felt protected in the wilderness. Why do we need to go into a materialistic world, as I said, a land that consumes its inhabitants? They wanted to stay in the yeshiva, in the kollel. Why should they have to go into the marketplace, into the Wall Street, where you have to deal with sharks, you have to deal with competition, corruption, all the temptations of the marketplace? They said, let's stay in this protected by the clouds of glory. They had miraculous food, bread from heaven, man. They had miraculous water from the Be'er Shel Miriam, the wellspring of Miriam. So why do they need to go and enter this material universe, which for them was like it was a descent? So you see their intention, though they were completely wrong, because God basically said, that's my purpose, is I want you to enter this world. Because their argument was basically, this world is too difficult for us. So really, in a philosophical sense, it's like the question of every soul doesn't want to come down to this earth. Life is difficult. That's why you have in the Mishnah, it says, God decrees, al karcha chatachai. God compels us to enter into this world. The soul on its own gravitates towards spiritual transcendence. And the same is true for the Talmud says there's a disagreement between the two great scholars, Shammai and Hillel, where one of them felt that it's more pleasant to be born than not to be born. That's what Hillel said. Hillel always found the beauty in everything. And Shammai, who's harsher, also Torah-based, more gvura, as opposed to chesed of Hillel, said it's more pleasant not to be born than to be born. So he says, Nuach la'adam shalei nivra mishanivra, more pleasant. So the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, in the Likutei Torah, explains, more pleasant, but more purposeful is to be born. More purposeful is to come down into the challenges of this difficult world. And that's why a soul has to be forced, literally forced to come down to this world. It's a decree. And even while it's here, it has to be forced to remain here, which is why we have the natural angst and the natural sense of transcendental urges, yearnings to reach a greater place. Because the soul always feels this is not its home. This is the restlessness of a healthy soul. It becomes unhealthy when the restlessness is not resolved, and the restlessness can turn into angst, can turn into anxiety into depression. But that's really not the theme of this discussion. It's just to point out that the Meraglim, the scouts, their intentions were very lofty ones. However, they were absolutely wrong. and their crime was great, precisely because they were so spiritual. If it was just some type of materialistic fear, it's one thing, you can forgive them for being afraid. It was precisely there was a form of like selfish spirituality. They wanted to take care of their own needs instead of having to fulfill God's purpose in this world, which requires entering a difficult life, a harsh one, a cruel life. So, nevertheless, as I was saying, this is their pure intention. So in that sense, you could say, there was a very powerful force. But it was wrong, and more importantly, the mob part of it, that was the big mistake. So when we say that what distinguished Caleb and Joshua from them was one step further. They too were spiritual, but they went to pray. As I said, Moses prayed for Joshua, and Caleb went himself to pray at the Maras HaMachpelah, at Hebron. And as a result, they had something that the others did. So why didn't the Meraglim go pray? If they were such spiritual people, they should have also gone to pray. If they got scared of the materialism, why did they forget that God had promised this land? Remember, this promise was not some type of new promise. It goes back hundreds of years back to Abraham. Every Jew, every man, woman, and child knew that the only reason we're here in Egypt, all those hundreds of years in exile, was because God had sent Jacob down, but God had also promised Abraham that after 400 years of being in a land that's not yours, you will be redeemed, you'll leave with great treasures, and you'll march towards the promised land. They knew why they were in the wilderness. It wasn't like some mystery. As difficult as it was, they knew where they were headed. What were they thinking? And how did Joshua and Caleb have the presence of mind to go pray? And why didn't they go pray if they were so spiritual, as I just emphasized? Because, as I said, there's a thing called spiritual selfishness. And when you become subjective, it blinds you. And the greater you are, the more blinded you become, because you're great. A person who doesn't see themselves so great, can always acknowledge that maybe I made a mistake, I have a blind spot. But when there's greatness can also go the other direction. Great souls can do great damage. The Talmud says, "Kol hagadol mechavere yitzrei gadol mimeno." The greater the person, the greater is the Yetzer Hara. The greater is his challenges. Greatness is a double-edged sword. So there's the classic story of Rab Shimon Bar Yochai. I think I mentioned it a few weeks ago. Rab Shimon Bar Yochai is the hero of Lag BaOmer, that period, that day, the 33rd day of the Omer that happens between Passover and Shavuos. Great pilgrimages take place till this day in Miran, northern Israel. So Rashbi is the author of the classic Zohar, the classical text of the Book of Splendor, of essentially, you could say, the father of Kabbalah. So the story Talmud tells is that when the Romans decreed that Jews were prohibited from studying Torah, he continued studying and spreading Torah. And because of that, they went looking to arrest and kill him. So he escaped and hid for 12 years. Him and his son, Rabbi Lazar, hid in a cave from the Romans. And there's a whole series of stories of how they survived. And obviously you can imagine they reached great spiritual heights those years, studying, praying, connecting, completely separate from all civilization. So 12 long years. Then finally word came that the Roman emperor had died, the decree had been abolished, and now they were able to come back to civilization. So here's the story, interesting episode. The Rashbi had become so pure in those years, so refined, that it says whatever he looked at as he returned back home, when he saw people, their involvement in the pettiness, in their superficial and stupid little lives, he was, as I said, so enlightened that whatever he looked at, the Talmud says, began to burn. Whether it was physical or metaphorical, but the idea was his spiritual eyes literally burned up everything around. So God says to him, no, that's not my purpose. That's not why you spend 12 years in a cave, being protected and hiding. You go back for one more year, a 13th year, bar mitzvah year. And there, you'll learn one more year of maturity, that when you come out, and that's what happened. When he came out, wherever he went, Rashbi went, he repaired. Instead of burning, he fixed. So you'd think, which was the higher Rashbi? Who was the greater one? The one that was so spiritually refined that everything burned around him? Or the one that had the restraint to be able to fix? So if you think about it purely from a so-called firepower level, purely quantity, of course the 12th year, Rashbi had that type of power. It's pretty amazing. He couldn't tolerate anything that was not holy, not pure, anything that was stupid or petty or meaning or insignificant, superficial. The truth is, however, qualitatively speaking, he was much higher level the 13th year, because his restraint was not that he became suddenly compromising, or he compromised his values and standards. He didn't go down a level, he went up a level. He went up a level realizing that he cannot be consumed with his own spiritual state of being. That's good for him, not good for anyone else. It's like, who's the greater teacher? The teacher that can reach the lowest student, or the teacher that can only teach great students? So the teacher that can bring metaphors and explain something even to kindergarten children, even ABC level, is a teacher who has such profound understanding that he's able to package it in the simplest of terms. They said Richard Feynman, the great physicist, was able to do that. Deceptively simple analogies from things that we see every day in the most complex, to explain most complex quantum mechanics and so on. So it says about King Solomon, his wisdom was that he was able to give 3,000 metaphors for any for any idea. And Hasidic thought explains 3,000 metaphors, not 3,000, he was so creative, he had 3,000 different examples, 3,000 levels of examples. He was able to reach 3,000 levels lower than himself. You know, most of us maybe 2-3 levels. 3,000 levels is almost unfathomable. Meaning to be able to reach meaning a metaphor for a metaphor for a metaphor for a metaphor 3,000 times down. That is both how profound he was and how he was able to package and present an idea without diluting it, without compromising it. That's, of course, the key. Now, the student may not see yet the depth in the metaphor and the example, but years later, a good teacher, it's planted in there, and when you suddenly say, aha, and you get it, you realize what kind of teacher you had, what kind of master, what kind of was able to feed you or give you, spoon feed you in a small dose, but it had this potency that has like a delay reaction. And as you get older and you start maturing and understanding, it's a whole different dimension. So Rav Shimon Bar Yochai reached the stage where they say not a tzaddik in pelts. When it's cold in the room, a tzaddik in pelts is a tzaddik who puts on a fur coat. So he keeps himself warm. I know this is a metaphor for the winter, not really fitting for today, but the idea, you get the idea. Let's put it this way, I don't know if it's the equivalent of a air conditioner that just cools you and nobody else, I don't know. But at least a fur coat warms you and nobody else. And a tzaddik, a higher level tzaddik, is someone who turns on a fireplace. So the whole room gets warm, including him. Distinction. Now the first tzaddik, at least he's not able to warm himself. Some people can't even do that. But the purpose of existence is not to just illuminate yourself or to warm yourself. It's to illuminate everything around you. Now, of course, this is not just a blanket statement. Everyone has to know where their stage is at. That's why some people, you may be at a stage where you need to first reinforce and fortify your own self. But there's no such thing as a person only doing one. We all are obligated to do both. You know, every morning, we only have one Shabbos in the week. Even though some people would argue it would be nice to have 6 days Shabbos and 1 day work day. But the purpose of existence is not Shabbos. The purpose is 6 days of the week, the work. To be infused with the power and the spirit of Shabbos. So we begin each day with prayer. So it gives us, it fortifies us. But the goal is then to bring the energy into the rest of the day, into the workplace, into a corrupt world, into a world that is antithetical sometimes to the holy, to the sacred, to the divine. And there to illuminate. So this is the Meraglim, you could say, were like Rashbi the first 12 years. They were very holy. As I said, when they went out on their mission, they were pure, good intentions. But when they saw materialism, not just read about it, and they saw it, they saw land that consumes its inhabitants, that was too much. So all the defenses went up. And then the next thing happened was the mob mentality. So here's a mob mentality that you can say is a holy mob, but that also is unacceptable. Caleb and Joshua understood and therefore prepared themselves, preempted it by going to pray at the grave of, Moses prayed for him, and Caleb went to pray at the grave of the patriarchs. In the Hasidic story they tell of a chassid. There was two young, bright scholars came to a town, and it was Friday, and Friday afternoon before Shabbos, some people, Hasidim, have the custom to go to the mikveh, a ritual bath. So these two young guys ask, where's the mikveh? This was a cold shtetl in Russia in midwinter, frosty winter day. So they said, in truth, during the winter, very few people nobody really goes to the mikveh because it's at the bottom of a hill, which is all covered with ice, very slippery. They said, no one in the entire town goes to the mikveh for Shabbat. He said, well, there's one old chassid who lives at the edge of town, he goes. No one really knows how he makes it, but he does. Now, they were two, as I said, scholars, and smart Alex as well. They were skeptical. So they decided they're going to follow this guy. Yeah. They wait outside his house, they see he's going, so they follow behind him, and yes, lo and behold, they start marching down this mountain. It's not exactly simple. He makes it all the way down without a hitch, even though he's over 80 years old. These two young 20s, in their 20s, one of them slipped and broke an arm, the other one, they just couldn't make it. They come to Shul Shabbos, they asked this man, they said, how did you, an older man, make it down this mountain, the slippery slopes, when we couldn't make it down there? So he answered, nonchalantly, without even any airs about him, he said, in Yiddish, he said, when you're bound, when you're tied above, you don't fall below. That was his answer. Now, obviously, it didn't mean that he was physically tied. It meant, on a deeper level, that when you're connected to something higher than you are, so no matter what happens below, you don't fall. In one of the Hasidic discourses, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe gives an example. He says, that the mitzvahs, they're sometimes compared to lifelines. They're compared to lifelines. Each mitzvah is like a rope that connects us to a higher world where we live in this world and we're on our own. It's very difficult to navigate. No matter even if you're an ethical person, a good person, we all got our challenges. As I discussed at length earlier, we all can get trapped in the mob mentality. We'll soon discuss. Here we're talking even a good mob mentality. But you can get trapped in that type of place. So he gives the analogy of a diver, those deep sea divers, not scuba diving. The ones that go down, with a pipe. What do they call them? The Navy divers, whatever. Is there a name for it? David, do you have a name for it? Those guys, they go down, right? With the helmets, right? And they don't go with a oxygen on their backs. They have the pipe. So it's interesting. He gives this analogy that obviously they're very cognizant every given moment of their life source, because for 1 second something happens to that pipe that's connecting them to the above the sea. They're in deep trouble, life threatening. So he explains that if we were all conscious like that, of like a deep sea diver of our lives, how much we're dependent, not optional, dependent on a higher source, it would be a different type of life. But we're blinded, we don't see it. The Talmud says, a person does not sin unless a moment of insanity enters into them. Now, this is not an answer or excuse in a court of law to plead insanity, because it doesn't mean the person is insane. It means that the temptation, the seduction of the moment, and all its passion is so powerful, the obsession, that it blinds you to the point that that moment you're insane. The reason we are still guilty is because you can control. You don't have to allow yourself to go there, as powerful as it is. But that's the power of a moment. And we all know from ourselves, when you get consumed with something, as much as irrational as it is, And even knowing at the moment and that you may regret it later, even knowing at the moment that it's all instant gratification, you still make the mistake. In Tanya he says that we all have the two voices inside of us that are at war with each other. The voice of the divine, the voice of the animal soul. And he says that the divine soul rests in the mind, so it has the element of reflective abilities, self-control. Mind over matter, moyach shal ta'alev, the mind ruling the heart. As Lawrence Taylor famously said when he was playing, he used to play Quite Hurt as a linebacker for the Giants, so I asked him, how do you play hurt? So he says, mind over matter. When you don't mind, it doesn't matter. Tanya, obviously, has a different take on the mind over matter, which is more simply self-control. And he says there, so therefore, we have natural self-control. So even though we have a voice inside of us that's impulsive, that comes from the heart, and it's emotional drive, but we have the power to counter that with reflecting and self-control. Then he goes on and says that there's two judges inside of each of us, the divine soul and the animal one. And then the God serves as the third judge. And the third judge, who, in other words, who creates the majority, consensus, always will side with the divine soul. So you'll have two against one. That's what he says in Tanya. And the obvious question that everyone asks is, so why, if that's the case, it's two against one, why is it that we're constantly listening to the other voice, the minority? And the answer, or one of the answer that I prefer, is because you don't remember they call the kangaroo courts, or I guess in the times of the Soviet Union, there was also a court of law. The only thing was there was only a prosecutor. There was no defense. So you had a prosecutor, and you had a whole bunch of series of allegations, and then you had to confess. That was the only option you had. Either you confess or you get killed. And if you confess, you also got killed. So that was what's called of course, a court of law. Now imagine the same thing here. This is the power. When you have an impulse to do something, you don't allow the defense attorney, your mind, to come and say, you know what, give me equal time to present you an equal case the other way around. Think the last time that you made a mistake. Did you really give equal time to another voice to wonder? Most mistakes are done impulsively. They're so powerful that you don't give any time. You don't think about it. Someone insults you. Someone says something to you. Something happens. You see something. You're tempted. You're seduced. Whatever it is. If you would just take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, overnight, think about it, it will always abate. It will always weaken. The biggest mistakes are made because we don't think about it, because it so conquers you, so consumes you, that you don't give any equal time. The equivalent of a court where there's only one voice, and you don't let the other lawyer speak. You don't let the other attorney say his opinion. If you did, then God would always side with the other one, there'd be two against one. Instead, you basically have 1 against 0. That's the problem. So that's up to us to allow that voice in. And this is a method that you can use even in simple things like telemarketing or other people trying to sell you something. So you'll always see good emotional manipulation is you got to get it now. If you don't do it right now, you'll lose the opportunity forever and ever. And it's going to save your life and so on. And then if you just gave it some thought, or you asked somebody, you consulted someone else, you suddenly discover this is a shmata, it's a piece of garbage or something. Or I can get it somewhere else if it's so good, why do I have to wait for them to call me? Why don't I go find a place to get it? I mean, that's on a small level, but the same is true on the bigger level. So this is what the Meraglim did not do, and what the two Cholov and Yeshua did do. They realized that we all have blind spots. They realized that as great as you are, you need to be tied above. And they tied themselves above, and that was why they didn't fall below. So let's go back now to mob mentality, herd mentality. We all have these two choices. Even though the fact is, and I began this at length making a case, most of us would not like to admit that if everybody was doing something wrong, you would stand up and say, this is wrong. If one of your co-workers, as I said, was being wrongfully accused, and everybody's joined the lynch, the mob, most people would not do much because they don't want to jeopardize their position. You start giving excuses. Maybe it's not the case. You don't find that very common. And I gave stronger examples of cannibalism and strong examples where people become monsters and they can turn on somebody. And I mentioned the Germans. And you see this, statistics have show that authority, for some reason, when you see a lot of people doing something. I mentioned before, would you march, if 500 people were going in one direction, would you march or would you go your own way? 500 people were going to lynch somebody, would you join them? So even if you argue maybe you wouldn't, what about if it were 5 million? What about if it was your entire community except you? Now, all of us have, despite what I just said, at the same time we all have another part of us, which is a divine soul, that you have the ability to stand up. When I said that most of us don't, is because we don't do it in actuality. But the potential, absolutely. But as long as you're not connected to that place, to that voice, that gives you the courage and strength to be yourself, you have only one option, not to be yourself, and to be a product or a victim or a ally to those forces and voices that expect things of you and demand things of you. This is true across the board. From childhood on, we're taught rules. Many of those rules are good rules. You go to class, you go to school, you're taught you don't just do what you want. You don't just grab somebody's toy, there's a way of getting along, coexisting. That part is fine, the discipline part. But then there comes a point where the rules become more important than you. And you lose yourself in it all. So that balance, to be able to have disciplines, knowing how to coexist with people, and not just selfishly just saying everything is about me. At the same time, not being completely reshaped and identified simply because you're a product or you're a part of a group of some herd is a difficult balance. It's much easier to either be a complete radical anarchist and just do anything and just not coexist with anyone, or to just be, which most people opt to be conformists. We don't have schools that really teach us that in-between place. And some are even terrified of it, because I've heard this from educators who told me, I'm afraid to allow the independent voice in my students to emerge because I don't know how far they're going to go with it. So I'd rather err on the side of them so-called tempering or silencing that voice in the face of coexistence and peaceful coexistence and so on. So, there's an argument to be made for it. But the question is, who gave you the right to make that decision? And didn't God create us all with individuality? Each of us has our own personality. No two of us are alike. I'm not suggesting it's an easy dance. It definitely requires a wisdom and a bittul, which is why we can't figure it out on our own. That's why we need to have being tied above and not falling below. See, the Meraglim, the biggest mistake they made was Moses had sent them to scout out the land. There's nothing wrong with that. It was not even if they had come back and said it's a very difficult land to conquer. That also would have been fine. That was what they were sent not to be an amen corner. They were sent to figure out what the situation is. So they're coming and saying, these are giants here. Let's avoid this, let's avoid that. But the problem was they came to a conclusion. They were asked how to enter the land. They weren't asked whether to enter the land. Their conclusion was the mistake. That was where their spiritual arrogance in a sense, came into play. They came to the conclusion, we can't do it. And that's where their lack of being tied above, in the fullest sense of the word, was their undoing. Because what happens is, when you don't have that connection, that independence is not connected with God, then independence, yes, can become anarchist. And then the other option is the mob. Because when you have nothing to stand on, who do you turn to for strength? You turn to others. How often have you been in conversations and there's certain people, like you get into an argument with someone and the other person, it's extremely annoying, and when you see the other person turn to a third person and say, tell me, what do you think is right? People tend to like to use another person to reinforce their position. And good manipulators are very good at doing this. They right away use the group or the crowd because it's like everyone gangs up. And in a sense, it's like an intimidating factor. Look, we all think this way. Not you're the one, there's something the matter with you. Now, people do this, of course. If you're insecure, you have to do that because it's another tactic to get to be right. But the fact of the matter is, what is the counterforce when we live in a world? Now, we do have to coexist with other people. We do go to work, as I said. What are you supposed to do? A person says a very fair question. I have a co-worker. This question has been posed to me more than once, that has wrongfully been accused of something, and now, and that person who my co-worker has also an attitude. I'm not saying she's perfect or he's perfect, and it's definitely fed into why people hate this person. Now they want to make the person, turn the person into a scapegoat. What am I supposed to do? If I get up and defend that person, and it's a wrongful scapegoat, we're not talking about a legitimate grievance. If I get up, I can jeopardize myself because then everyone will turn on me. You know, it's a legitimate question. What should you do? So there's no real black and white answer, to be honest, because the best thing, of course, to do is to turn to the person who's in charge and go into them privately and say, I have to tell you, I know personally this person is not to be blamed. Now, of course, if your superior is a low life, they're going to use it against you. That's another concern. That's why it's not black and white. If you had that recourse, that would definitely be the thing to do. To ignore it all, make believe like nothing happened, and just to protect your own skin, it's not the way. Now, what happens if your superior is actually using, which is very common in workplaces, where superiors play workers against each other. They like this. First of all, that gives them control. They also weaken everybody. It's a type of psychological game, and so on and so forth. Well, this is part of why the Meraglim, the scouts, didn't want to go into Israel. They didn't want to go into a land that consumes its inhabitants. They didn't want to deal with such type of compromising situations. But let's play it out. What do you do in a situation like that? Should you quit? If you see right around you corruption, you're working in a place where people around you are corrupt, should you quit? But if you quit, will you get another job? You need the parnasa, you need the money. I mean, these are part of moral dilemmas we struggle with. But here's the answer. What would Joshua and Caleb do? You have their story, what they did. They were almost killed for their voice. But one thing they were not afraid of was because they were tied above. You see, the dilemmas I just all described are all legitimate dilemmas, and I don't have a black and white answer, but I can tell you what the formula is to find your answer. The formula is to find who you are. See, the problem is, you have either, as I said before, two options. You either become a loner and almost an anarchist because you can't get along with anybody because you're just a fierce, independent soul, or you become a conformist. How is there a third option if you have a God? If you know how to tie yourself above, if you know how to pray, if you know how to trust something greater than you, that gives voice, that gives strength to your voice. And as your voice becomes strong, you'll know what to do in situations. You see, the problem we have is when the mob is doing something, it's easy to go along. You don't stand out. You don't have to be, you won't be stigmatized. It feels good, whatever it is. The only counterforce to that is that you have a higher calling, that you have something that makes you completely unique. You're not part of this group. So just to say, I'm going to be a hero and stand up for morality, some people do that. That itself is an ego trip. That's not what Caleb and Yeshua did. They did something very humble. They prayed to God. They connected to God. And therefore, it made no difference. They saw Israel not through the eyes of the mob. They didn't see it through the eyes of the other 10 scouts. They didn't see even though the millions of Jews were crying that night, it made no difference. They saw it. They said God promised. The clarity they had came from humility, came from a connection to a higher place. The scouts got all blinded by the fears, then blinded probably by everybody responding to their incitement. There's a power to that. When you incite a whole nation and everybody's listening to you, it's very hard to suddenly be very objective and step back and say, maybe I got it wrong. And this, mind you, is all a healthy group of people. What I mean by healthy is their intention was, as I said, spiritual. Now let's take into account what most of the mob mentality or herd mentality in our lives, it's very little to do with spirituality. It's the other extreme. So there for sure, one has to really think about it. So the only real way to be an independent individual in this world that literally harasses us, I would say even abuses us to conform, forces us to conform, simply by sheer intensity, sheer, you're going to be part of a community. There's some way that there's no way that you can really break out. The only answer is, as that chassid told them, to be tied above, you don't fall below. And that's a whole process of how you get to that place, which I shall discuss in a few moments. So, in addressing this whole issue, the first thing we have to all acknowledge, and this is the key thing, is that none of us are immune to being part of the herd. Everybody is affected by the masses. If a celebrity walked right now into this room, everybody would turn, unless you didn't recognize the celebrity. But you know something? Even if you didn't recognize it, if everyone else turned, you'd also turn. That's what it's about. It's a vicious cycle. And that's a small, subtle example. But we are constantly affected by everything around us, to the point we don't even recognize its impact. Well, as I said before, what we eat, what we drink, even when we're, so to speak, taking control of our lives, who exactly inspired you to do that, how much you're paying for it, etc., etc. I'm not suggesting that there aren't glimpses and moments of so-called freedom and emancipation in our lives, but we are products of a world around us, and especially when you take into account our childhood, when we were impressionable children, the attitudes of our parents, experiences in our lives, painful ones. All these things have a very deep impact. And we live in a world that is not a secure world. How many secure people do you really know? Really secure people. Some of us don't even know what it means to be a secure person. What would be the criteria of a secure person? What's the definition of a secure person? A person that is courageous, a person that is bold, a person that took chances and risks. Is that a secure person? Some people say the people who take the greatest risks are the people who have the least to lose, the ones that have been most hurt. I was reading last week the obituary on, I forgot her name, she was an author of a book called Damage that turned later into a film. And this quote of hers, quite a devastating quote. She writes, it's a fictional story, a work of fiction, but she writes about this woman who's I don't know if the word heroine is the right word, but let's put it this way, the villain in the story. So the woman tells, I guess her boyfriend, she says, I am damaged. And damaged people are very dangerous because they know they can survive. And the story goes on to demonstrate that in very devastating ways. It just struck me the line. We as Jewish people have also been hurt, and we've seen a lot. And our answer is, we've seen the abyss, and we've survived, and not only survived, but we've thrived. So not everybody that gets hurt, the damage, becomes damaged. See, she said she was damaged. So the fact that you can survive can be very dangerous, it's true, but also survival can also show resilience. It all comes down to where the strength is coming from. If you think you're the person that has strength, or it's coming from a higher place. So, in talking about a world like ours, I have traveled, I would say, extensively. I've been around. I can't say I'm the most exposed person in this world. I've seen everything. But from what little I've seen, very few secure people. The only ones I've met were the ones that were tied above. To me, security has always come, and I've always seen it coupled with a word you wouldn't usually couple with security. Coupled with the word humility. Most people think secure people, it's about strength. It's about courage, as I said. Fortitude, power. Real security comes from humility. It comes from the understanding that you are not self-made, and no matter how secure and you fortify entrench yourself in your armor, you never can be totally secure. The wise people in this world know this material world cannot be fully secure, because materialism by definition is ever-changing. It's a temporary universe. Everything erodes, everything ages, everything dies. So would you imagine building a building on a foundation that's constantly shifting? How secure can you be? So whether we acknowledge this or not, unconsciously, we all know it. Which is why money and material success actually builds more insecurity. The more you worship it, the more insecure you become. because you're building it on something that cannot be, doesn't have a permanent nature to it. By definition, it has to weaken as it goes. Money is spent. So as soon as you spend, I need more, because I need more for the amount to compensate that which I'll spend. So I want to have so much that as much as I spend, I will always have something to rely on. Think of the logic in that. And there's no end. How much is that? $1 billion? $100 billion? You know, obviously there's certain numbers that are not so that easily achievable. But the logic of it is such, I want to have enough so that as much as I spend, I'll have something to lean back on. But whatever you have here is what's called, as much finite objects as you have, it never can reach infinity. So weakness and insecurity doesn't begin is not defined by quantity, it's defined by quality. Take for another extreme, love. Someone that you truly love, or someone who truly loves you in a healthy way. It's unconditional type of love. We're not getting now into the secret how you find such love. But just for a moment, that concept. The way a parent loves children. Again, I'm talking about a healthy situation. There's unhealthy and abusive, dysfunctional, but a healthy type of love. That love is not defined. There's no such thing as how much love do you love me. You know, my grandmother, who had 9 children, was asked when she had her children, it wasn't so popular to have 9 children. She said, so how do you, she was asked by a friend, a secular person, so how do you find the ability to divide your love into 9 parts? You know, like every time you have another child, it's like gets less. Now, of course, that question can only come from someone who's like an accountant or an actuary or somebody who measures things in that way. My grandmother told her very simple. It's like the sun. How many raindrops can the sun reflect itself? The answer is infinite amount of raindrops. It's not a quantity type of thing. When you know you have such love coming to you, it's not a question of how much and that is enough for me to put away so I should be secure. Every drop is filled with infinite power. When a parent feels that to a child feels it coming from a parent, we all know what the feeling is like. And when you know you have that, yes, of course you'd love to be able to spend more time physically with someone you love. When you know you have that, you can be 1,000,000 miles away, it's still there. So this material world, by definition, is a world of insecurity. And therefore, some of us respond to that by hoarding. You hoard. You hoard, you gather, you collect, you acquire, whether it's power or networking or equity, money, etc., etc. I'm not suggesting we don't need it to be able to survive in this world, obviously, but it cannot be an end in itself. So the same is true in peer recognition and how we look at how other people accept or don't accept us. The fact is, as the Rambam writes, Odem Medinihu, a person is a social creature. We are social animals. We need each other. Rare is the person, unless something has hurt them deeply, that can exist without any friends. We need it. We need a social interaction for stimulation, for recognition, for confirmation, affirmation. I mean, for many reasons. We need it. And I don't just mean in the romantic sense that you need a companion in your life. That's even on basically on a purely social level. Again, I'm not even talking about the quality of your social circle, but we need it. So, as Hillel said, "Imena nili mili." If I'm not being for myself, who am I? But then he also said, "Manila atzmi ma'ani." If I'm only for myself, what am I? Essentially, that second statement is the social dimension. We need each other. But as I said earlier, the question is, how much does that? What do you give up for that need? And here's where we get lost. How do you balance these two? So you will see most of us don't balance them. What we do is we go from one extreme to the next. I know this woman who was hurt very deeply in her childhood. And she completely obliterated, as she said it. Annihilated. My identity was annihilated, she often says. And then she finally went through different therapy and finally at some age in the early 30s started discovering herself. And now, as she puts it, now I'm spending the next 30 years of my life taking care only of myself. She's gone to the other extreme. And yes, very selfish. I don't judge or blame somebody because in a way when you don't have oxygen for 30 years and you finally get it, you hold on to your dear life. And I understand where it's coming from. But it's an extreme reaction to extreme situation. Extreme deprivation always leads to extreme indulgence. Obviously, the balance is the key. So a person like that, the goal would be, again, I'm not being judgmental, the goal would be find God, find a connection that nurtures you so you don't have to go to the other extreme. Now, each of us are in our own situation. It's hard to really create a formula. How much time should you dedicate to yourself and how much time do you dedicate to others? There's no one formula for everybody because each of us are in a different place in our lives. I would say, however, a person has to have both. Has to have both. And the balance is the hardest part because it's much easier and much simpler to just go along with the flow of others, the tide. You know, the tide's going this way, yeah, let's just go along. To stand up and have the courage to say, here's my position, here's what I'm going to do. I will travel on the road less traveled. I'm going to do the choice that is not so popular, requires a strength. If it's coming from a healthy place, if it's coming from, as I said with this woman, if it's coming from rebelling against years of being a conformist, years of being shaped by others, then it's going to go the other extreme. But to be able to find your own voice in a healthy way requires understanding that you have a unique divine mission. And it makes no difference what anyone else in this room says or anyone else in this community says. This is my divine mission. What I would submit is that most of us lack that connection. What is my mission? Once you know that, I'm not saying it's going to be easy. There's still going to be plenty challenges of how you stand up for yourself. Do you go along with when everyone seems to be going in that direction, whether it's because you say, I won't make a difference anyway, you know. And there's ways to measure this. The ways to measure it is, you know, one of the ways is like, for example, when someone challenges you to take on a new project or to do something different that you haven't done. What's your first reaction? All the reasons that it can be done, or all the reasons that it could be done? Now, of course, a sober person has to review both sides, because you have to know whether this plan will work. But what's the first reaction? Knee-jerk reaction. An interesting way of some people, knee-jerk reaction will always tell you why it can't happen. This reason, that reason, that reason. What you're really hearing is an insecure person who's afraid of walking into new waters, and definitely is not asking, what does God want? Because that would really be the question. If this is the mission God wants me to do, that's what I do. Makes no difference whether I'm comfortable or I'm not comfortable. But that requires a connection, that being tied above. Many people who are mavericks are often, I have to say, rebounding because they've been deprived, so they are other extremes. It's not necessarily coming from the healthiest place. I still admire it, and I'm not suggesting there isn't greatness to be achieved. But the question is if it's sustainable. Because if it's still coming from within you, it's going to have to gravitate back and forth from the insecure place to the secure place. So I don't think in one discussion, one evening, we can all turn from a herd mentality into becoming independent spirits. But hopefully the story of the Meraglim can shine light, because if they could have fallen to that level, we all can stoop to it. And on the other hand, we have Kalev and Yeshua as examples of people who were bound to something higher. It was not about them. Because if it was about them, you know something, they may have chosen also to go along with the group because it would have been more popular. If it was about them, they could have chosen maybe to go against the group, but it's again for their own gain, because then they're the heroes. The third option is people who have the humility of recognizing, it's not about me. What is needed in this situation? And if this is what's needed, this is what I shall do. That gives strength. So it's not, I would say, strength doesn't come because you're a strong person, that's why you exude strength. If you're a humble person, and you have a God in your life, you are naturally going to be strong. It's a whole different take on the power, on where strength comes from. So there are people who are born with strong characters, personalities, or life has toughened them, and they're assertive, and they know how to protect themselves or others, and God bless them all. But there's a different strength that comes from within, that your soul was sent here on a mission that is divine, and nothing else in this world can take that away from you. It doesn't matter if 6 billion people decide that they have another plan, that's their problem. You got your mission. Most of us, lack of knowing a mission, what we turn to, what do we gravitate to? Who's going to tell, what should I do? So we turn to people we respect. We turn to groups sometimes that we think that can be there for us. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they disappoint as well. So I'm not suggesting a group can be helpful, but a group that doesn't, if you're not an individual inside of a group, you'll probably be swallowed up by the group. A person, when we say, for example, we come to shul and we daven with a minyan, we have a quorum, we have a community, a kehila as they say. The big mistake, people think that Judaism is driven by groups. Because you see, wherever there comes prayer, benching, it's all about a group. You need a minyan, is there a minyan, is there not a minyan, is there mazuman, is there 10 minyan, this type of thing. The truth is, it's a grave error, it's not correct. When the Jews stood at Mount Sinai, which we just honored 2 weeks ago, Shavuos. Actually, it was 1 week ago, what am I saying? Wow, time flies, okay. Is it time flies or time going slow? Which one is it? One of the two. It feels the same. So when we stood at Mount Sinai and you read the 10 Commandments, it says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. In Hebrew, when you speak to a group, you use a different term than when you speak to an individual. Like when I say you, it could be all of you here. It could be you, it could be everybody on earth. And you say you also to an individual, come with me, or I like you, or something like that. In Hebrew, when you speak to a group, you say lochem. You speak to a person, a male lecha, to a woman loch. So the 10 Commandments, the question the Medrash asks, should have been written in the singular. In the plural. Because there were millions of people standing there. So it should have said, Anochi Hashem Elokeichem. Or Kabed as Avichem, honor your parents. Your as in plural. And it says Kabed as Avicha, honor your father and mother. I am your God in the singular. So the Medrash has a very fascinating, a very, you could say, progressive answer, especially considering that 3,500 years ago, the concept of individuality didn't really exist. The Medrash answers precisely that every person standing at Sinai heard the voice of God as if no one else was standing there. Completely singular. They heard God speaking to me. And the fact that there were 1,000 people, 100,000, a million, whatever the number was, around, that's nice, but they heard speaking to me. Rabbi, the chief rabbi of England, the British Empire, as they like to call it, that has been shrinking in the last 100 years. Some say whatever the British Empire touched has turned into a mess. So the chief rabbi, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who I know, told me once that when he was, it's a known story, but he told me a detail I never had heard, that he was a student at what's called Jews College. Where else in England? But in England you have a college called Jews College. Around here it would sound racist if someone called the Jews, college. And he was studying philosophy, and one of what he wanted to do for his dissertation, he came to the United States to interview in the late 60s a few of the Jewish leaders. And he chose, I think, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein and a few others, including the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he tells the story that when he went to all of them, he interviewed them. When he came to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rebbe interviewed him and asked him all about what's going on in the colleges, in his college, in the community. And then the Rebbe said to him that, my suggestion is this, even though I think he said that people don't give unsolicited suggestions, nevertheless I'm going to give you an unsolicited suggestion. That instead of pursuing and graduating with a degree in philosophy, a doctorate in philosophy, you should go into the rabbinate. Because what are you going to do with your philosophy? You'll become a professor. As a rabbi, you can use your philosophy and all the other things you study to help people. And as a young student or a graduate student, he was impressed with that, and he decided to do it. He didn't call himself a chassid, but it made sense. So he went to the rabbinate. So when he first got his first rabbinic position, before he became chief rabbi, he spoke at his first congregation. He had his first pulpit. And he gave credit to the Rebbe. He says, I wouldn't be here today as a rabbi if it was not for this man in New York who told me this. So he said a woman came over to him afterwards and said, tell me, you speak so highly about this Rebbe, and you're now our new rabbi. Can you tell me the difference between a Rebbe and a rabbi? So he said, well, you saw it tonight. He said, a rabbi can speak to 500 people, and everybody thinks he's speaking to somebody else, to the person sitting there. And when a Rebbe speaks, he could be speaking to 10,000 people, and everyone thinks he's speaking to me. He says, that's the difference. So when the Jews stood at Sinai, they heard each one the personal touch. Why am I saying this? I'm emphasizing because this is so counter the stereotype that most of us have. I don't know about us, everyone in this room, but most people have about religion in general and Judaism in particular. Of course, reinforced by our great icons like Woody Allen, etc. That Judaism is all about conformity. It's all about the group, the mob, about doing what everyone else is doing. And even those that some people criticize it cynically and dismiss it, but even those that actually embrace it will say it's for good reason. It's good reason, at least it keeps people in line. That's like the great justification. Now, what's the other side? The other extreme is anarchy, and other extreme, everyone's going to just do what they want. So yes, we give up our independence, individuality, for what? For order, discipline. Which is common in every business, in every corporate structure, discipline, school. You can't just be who you are, it's a group. But it's really, truth is, it infuriates me, to be very honest, because it's so counter to Jewish thinking, because it's counter to God. Then God should have created one person on this earth, or a group of clones, and not give them independent thinking. Why did he create so many different type of people with different opinions, different personalities? So you're talking about the sanctity of diversity here. You're not just talking about, either we're all going to just be clones and puppets, or we're going to do what we want. You're talking about a divine issue here. What's God's bigger plan? And therefore, when they stood at Sinai, it wasn't just a matter of they all hearing the same thing here. It was critical. God is talking to you, telling you your mission in life. Your mission is not your mission. So it has to be completely customized and tailored to you. Yes, it's true, we do things that have common denominators. We all say, let's say in Jewish prayer, Shema. We say the same words. But each person should say it, and even the same person should say it each time with different kavanah, with different soul and heart and intention. But we always gravitate to the easier. The easier is everyone does the same thing. So a shul, a minyan, a synagogue, a kehillah was never meant to replace individuality, it was meant to enhance it. What's the enhancement? The enhancement is, if you have a group of 1,000 individuals, each one fiercely individual, and they come together for one cause, then you got yourself real synergy. If you have a herd that comes together and they're just all subjugating themselves, annihilating their voices, then you have 1,000 clones. You only have one person. You don't have power. You just have a copy machine, a carbon copy. I remember my son came home, he was so excited about it. He was a teenager, and I just remember his excitement. It excited me. He said, I saw a smile on his face. He said, I learned today an interesting thing. Someone told me, you were born an original. Don't become a copy. Which of course is simple, but it was like his epiphany he got then. But I remember it till this day, because I saw he learned that. I said, well, listen, remember that, because it's very easy to, it's good on paper, and to live by it is not so simple. And it's what happens. You heard that talk, I forgot who it is, this British educator, one of these TED conference 18-minute talks, Chai minute talks. So very interesting. Some of those talks are brilliant, really mind-blowing. This guy, very good. He talks about education, the whole education system. And he goes back to the axioms. What's our education system based on? Who developed it? We're talking about the elementary school system. Where did it come from? It's not like thousands of years old. And the Greeks study differently than we do. So it comes basically, he traces it to Napoleonic and, what was his name? Emperor Ferdinand from Prussia or something, who essentially were developing, they wanted to have good soldiers. And hence the word elementary. They wanted to have good soldiers, so the training, the focus, was not on the arts and not on the social sciences, but it was primarily on the physical sciences. Math, efficiency, numbers, law, medicine, and so on. And essentially what his argument is that children naturally are much more musical and artistic, which what we call an extracurricular thing, and that's really their natural place. And we cut it out from them to force them to become efficient, what's it called, what's the word for it? Construction workers, basically, in that sense. Of course, we glorify it. So, it's an interesting take on the whole thing, and I was thinking how that affected Jewish education. I see it's very similar. Jewish education, a lot of it is very much focused on efficiency. Master the knowledge, master Aleph Beis, Chumash, Mishnah, Shulchan Aruch, law, history. It's fact-based. You don't have a lot of focus on the sublime, on the spiritual, on the soulful, on the abstract, on the mystical. Now, I went to yeshivas where they taught Chassidus, so but even there it was taught almost like you teach law, which meaning technical. You have 5 levels of the neshama. There's a tzaddik, a beni, and a rasha. And then I had to untrain myself from that to come to think that it works differently when you think about sublime ideas. You can't think about God like you think about how you bake a cake with a bunch of ingredients. It's not that linear. It's not that defined. So we live in a tangible world, and mastering a tangible world requires tangible sciences. But there's a whole untangible part. And I just read that Einstein in Princeton had one of the signs on his desk or on his wall. It said like this: not everything you count counts. Not everything you can count counts, and not everything that counts you can count. Here's a man, a mathematician, a physicist. Just thought it was a great way to put it. Not everything you can count counts, and not everything that counts you can count. In other words, there's a whole other dimension to reality. So to sum up, of course, there's so much more can be said about this, and we could, we'll spend a lifetime on it. But I think the Pasha, this chapter, has an unbelievable lesson to each of us. Above all, we can be a real Kolav in Yeshua. We could enter the Promised Land. We don't have to be a copy. We are originals. You can be you. But to do that requires a few serious prices to pay. The first price, so to speak, is, I don't mean financial prices, I mean psychological ones. First is that don't deceive yourself into thinking you're not part of the herd. We're all part of the mob. No question about it. Even when we think we're not. Because we're trained to be that way, our pride may not acknowledge it, but we're part of it. You're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. The 10 Nasim, the 10 leaders here, the scouts, were also part of it. And they incited a whole nation. They brought on tears for generations to come, like Talmud says, that God said, you cried that night, Tisha B'Av, it was Tisha B'Av, because you didn't want to enter the Promised Land, now you will cry forever. This wasn't a punishment. God was saying, you cried, I'll make you cry. It was cause and effect. You disconnect yourself from me, you disconnect yourself from being tied above, being bound above, then what are you left with? You're left like a ship without a rudder. You're left to your own devices. And your own devices, you're in a stormy material world. In a stormy material world, you cannot survive. So it wasn't a punishment, it was cause and effect. Their tears were a sign of the mob mentality shaping them into going a path which was absolutely not what God had intended. So first thing is not to deceive ourselves. We all have been trapped in this way. We've all been part of the mob in one way or another. It may not be maybe too aggressive to call it a mob, call it a lynch mob or whatever you want to call it, but part of that. The second step is, once you're aware of that, is that you have a voice inside of you. You have a soul inside of you that is absolutely independent. And you don't have to be part of that. But for you to be able to have the strength to march to your own tune requires that type of connection. And yes, prayer can hurt. Not only can hurt, it's necessary. Kalev went to the gravesite of the patriarchs. Yeshua was prayed for, because it's a sign that you're ready to ask for strength above yourself. You don't have to wait to become a recovering alcoholic to embrace the first of the 12 steps, that I don't have the power over my life and I surrender to higher power. Anechi Hashem Elokecha, which is the first of the 10 commandments, says that to people who do not necessarily in rehab, because it's the secret of all life. Unfortunately, those people that fall come to learn it the hard way. But every healthy person who thinks about it should understand that there is a higher force. And when you're connected to that, then you can begin to navigate. Then you find your voice. So the lesson in this parsha is twofold. It tells us how low people can fall and become part of this mob, become part of this demand, instigation, mass instigation against God, against the Promised Land, against Israel. And hey, today we have that too. Look what's going on. Over years of PR and years of propaganda, look at the attitude. Israel, very easy for the world to suddenly decide to gang up. And some people just need to see a lot of others doing it, and they'll just march with them. You know, Jews always knew that you can't rely on others. You have to have the inner fortitude. Just because everybody's demanding something from you doesn't mean it's true, doesn't mean it's right. Of course, this is a whole other discussion. I don't want to touch it without really going more in depth, but I just wanted to say it because of what's going on out there. But to have your voice, it's not just enough to say, I don't want to go with the mob. The question is, someone says, okay, so what's your voice? You don't want to go along with the whole surge in one direction. What is your voice? That's what we have to commit to on a week like this. And this parsha gives us strength to do so, to commit to find that voice. And you do it through studying Torah, through doing a mitzvah, through doing things that are not necessarily what you want to do, to put it bluntly. Because if you want to do it, then it's again an extension of you. You have to do something that you don't want to do. I don't mean, God forbid, something that is repulsive or that is dangerous. But I'm talking about something that demands of you to go out of yourself, go out of your comfort zone. So this week of Shelach, we have that power and ability. And what can I say? It's an honor to sit with independent souls like yourself and create a new generation of individuals that are not just controlled by mass media and the mass hypnosis or mass whatever you call it, mass thinking. Know that we each have that dignity of being individual souls on our journey. So please see me, Meaningful Life Center, even though as we jump from place to place, but we hopefully maintain our mission that is unwavering. And myself, Velvel, Jeff, as friends and allies to all of you, to everyone online, whoever is out there. And we will resume this class next week. I believe it's back to the location on is that right? Well, let's put it this way. Make sure to read your emails, because that's where we announce it. And we'll try to find new ways to do it. Maybe I should have posted on Facebook. That's the thing. Okay. I just thought of that. But regardless, we will let you know. And if you don't have... I'm sorry? Tweet it. The Facebook tweets already. Let's not push it. And with Anthony Weiner tweeting, yeah. And tomorrow night, Philip is giving his class, correct? At his, if you want information, just call us either at our office or email us at meaningfullife.com. Philip's class is tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. And we'll be here next Wednesday. And it's a great honor to be here and sit with you. Thank you very much.